All right, well, we should be having Mayor Reed and Denise momentarily, so I think we should go ahead and get started as I see folks are joining. Great to be with all of you. I'm Jonathan Dworkin, Vice President of Policy and Communications here at NewDEAL, and welcome to today's breakout session where we're focusing on addressing unfinished learning and pursuing long-term equity in our education system, and particularly looking at the opportunities available through the American Rescue Plan. This is part of a series of discussions we are having at today's summit and beyond, focused on long-running inequities exacerbated by the pandemic and solutions for ensuring that we come out of this crisis with an economy that works better for everyone. Today's session is also the next step in the work of the NewDEAL Forum Education Policy Group. Many thanks to Phillip and the Alliance for Excellent Education for their great partnership in this work. We're building on the report that we released with the Alliance just a few months ago, and really feel like the recommendations of the group include a roadmap for addressing some of the pressing issues highlighted by the crisis of the past year. We'll make sure at some point here to post a link to the report if you haven't seen it in the chat, but talks about some of the immediate responses that are needed to COVID, including better access to broadband, but also, the increasing urgency of offering high-quality college and career pathways, especially to all young people amid a changing economy. And we're going to be hearing from our co-chairs of the group here in just a moment. I do want to give folks just some logistics to start. Our session does have a max capacity of people who can be on audio and video at any given time. So if you want to contribute to the discussion on video, just click Ask to share audio and video. That allows us to approve your request and you can begin participating on camera. If we hit our cap of people on camera, of course, we'll shift people back and forth as needed. You can also leave from being on camera at any time and come back. I also encourage everyone to engage using the chat box to the right, typing anything in the session chat. We'll post messages only visible to those who are here in this virtual room with us. You can type the @ button plus someone's name if you'd like to direct a question or comment to a specific participant. You can also go to the People tab to send private direct messages. And finally, you can double click on a speaker to make that speaker bigger on your screen. So with that, I want to get started by bringing in our co-chairs of the Education Policy Group. I think we may still be waiting for Mayor Reed from Montgomery, Alabama, but I see we've got Senator Elena Parent from Atlanta, Georgia, and also former West Sacramento Mayor Chris Cabaldon, who we can bring on as well. So Senator Parent, would love for you to get us started, and then we'll bring in some of our other speakers to dig into this topic as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, and good afternoon to all my NewDEAL friends and NewDEAL leaders. I am honored to serve as a co-chair of this education policy working group, which is coming up with so many fantastic ideas that all of us can implement at the state and local level to take our college pathways and our career pathways to the next level. And before I make a couple of remarks about some of the things that I'm working on in that regard in Georgia and that our work is tailored around with the working group, I do want to say that I hope we'll be able to be in person the next time we have an idea summit, because as much as this is better than nothing, I really miss getting to see everyone's face and have all of those more informal conversations. Networking over Zoom is certainly more difficult, and I miss y'all, but I also want to thank NewDEAL for helping us still have these summits during the pandemic, and for all of the great work that all of you do on a daily basis, supporting us. And I'm also really excited about our new NewDEAL co-chairs. So back to the topic at hand. So one of the big things that our working group has been focused on is tailoring and expanding the partnerships between academic institutions that have been sort of siloed off from each other and college well, college would also be an academic institution, but employer for sure, and workplace areas that have been siloed off from each other and not coordinating as well as they could be to accomplish several goals that we know are critical for the functioning of today's economy and the success of today's students. We have far too many students that don't see the relevance of school. It's not tailored specifically enough to what they would, find meaning in as far as a career outcome or a college outcome, but I think more frequently it would be a career outcome, because all of these different groups that are working in silos or institutions working in silos are so siloed off from each other. They're not having the cross coordination they really need to make sure that we do have the type of prepared high skilled workforce coming out of high school and feeding more kids into post-secondary education. They are reliant on each other, the K through 12, the community colleges, and the employers, and as well as us as government leaders. Like, we're all reliant on cooperation amongst all those fields, but frankly, it's just not happening as much as it really needs to be. And that has serious ramifications for the preparedness of our students and workforce, as well as how many we lose through dropping out. So here in Georgia, we've done some good work around that. We do have a dual enrollment program allowing kids to start taking college courses while they are still in high school, and they can earn credits towards their certificate or post-secondary diploma or credential while they're still earning their high school diploma. But I'm working on a couple things to try to take it to the next level here, and really being supported quite well by NewDEAL and by Phillip, Lovell and his group. And so one of the things that we're not doing particularly well in Georgia is setting out clear goals for our Move On When Ready program, which is our dual enrollment program. What exactly are our goals? And then how do we as a state legislature and state government propose to meet those goals? So I'm working on legislation that I've filed before, but trying to tailor it, that would help us set out sort of the specific goals of the program, which would include, getting kids that have had less opportunity to attend college because of family circumstances, making sure that they are able to really take advantage of these programs. That's one goal that I think we need to do a lot better job in acknowledging and tracking here in Georgia. We also have a sort of start in Georgia to some cooperation and collaboration between high schools and employers, but frankly, it's not formal enough. We don't really have the appropriate state structure in place to make sure those conversations are really happening and that they're sustainable. And Georgia's a pretty big state. We've got 11 million people. So we haven't really begun any kind of regional approach where you're pulling in regional and business leaders to work in concert with K-12 and the community colleges. And it's not going to only work here in a state as big as ours to take a just state government approach. We really need a state government approach, but then we need collaboration through the regions. And because all of these groups have been siloed for so long, sustaining it is something that is going to be a challenge, because there's not a hierarchy within which they all answer. So it's baby steps, but that's some of what we are working on. And I really think that this work, while complex, because of some of the challenges I just mentioned, is just thoroughly critical to really reimagining high school education and college education in the United States and meeting the needs of tomorrow's employers. And let's face it, meeting the needs of today's families too. Because when you're able to have post-secondary credentials, going to be that much more likely to be able to be successful and climb an economic ladder. So thanks so much for having me. Oh, and really quickly, also, we have such a huge opportunity with the COVID relief money. So that's something that, I've really been trying to talk up. Money that we have not had before at our disposal should be going to set up some of these long-term structures that will pay dividends over time. And I think we should all be considering that and raising our voices around that.
Perfect. Thank you, Senator. And that's a perfect segue, I think, into talking to some of our other folks who are joining the discussion today. I know one of our other co-chairs, Mayor Reed, hopefully is going to be able to hop on. Just heard there was a police shooting in Montgomery, Alabama that he's dealing with. So wishing all the best to everybody affected there. But we're going to just jump right in and build right off the Senator's comments on the rescue plan. I think we're thrilled to have Ian Rosenblum serving as Acting Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Education. Joining us formally, he was the Executive Director of the Education Trust New York. He's led an ambitious equity agenda there. That's one of our major themes that we're working on. He's been working to eliminate gaps in equity, opportunity, and achievement that hold back so many students. Prior to joining EdTrust, he also served as Deputy Secretary for Education and Economic Opportunity to New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. So Ian, thank you so much for being here. Phillip, as always, has been a fantastic partner. We're great to have you back. Phillip, the Associate Executive Director at the Alliance for Excellent Education, which works to promote high school transformation to make it possible for every child to graduate prepared for post-secondary learning and success in life. He's done just a tremendous amount of work on Capitol Hill with the White House and with states to advocate for policy that will prepare the nation's students to graduate prepared for college and career. So thrilled to have you both. I know, as I mentioned, we also will be joined by Denise Forte, the CEO at Education Trust, which is totally focused on equity in education in just a little bit. So why don't we just kind of jump right in. I think one of the things we wanted to talk about is the rescue plan and the opportunity there, as the Senator was just mentioning, and folks who are on should feel free to weigh in by the chat or to come on video. But Ian, we'll just kind of start with you about the kind of historic investment in public education that is happening now as a result of the rescue plan. And could you just give us, a brief kind of broad summary of what those buckets of funding are and just what the opportunity is that states and cities should be aware of?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me and the department participate in this event. Really thrilled to be able to talk to you about the American Rescue Plan and its impact on education, and particularly for students who've been historically underserved and most impacted by the pandemic. I think the Senator's comments really teed this up in an important way. When we think about the nearly $130 billion in funding for education at the K-12 level in the American Rescue Plan, we really focus on the ways that it will enable us to continue to help safely reopen and sustain in-person instruction, starting even this spring, so that we're really able to maximize those opportunities for students, and to address the impact of the pandemic on the nation's students. And again, to do so through a clear equity lens. The opportunities here are really powerful, and that's why we've been having so many discussions with all different groups of stakeholders about the important role that they have to play in making sure that these resources are used wisely, that they're used urgently, and that they're used in a way that addresses the pre-existing inequities in our education system that were exacerbated by the pandemic. And so as we think about the uses of these critical resources, and particularly the $122 billion in funding for what's called the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Reserve, or ESSER fund. It's really a way to provide more safe in-person learning opportunities for students quickly, to support students' social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs, to address, as I mentioned, the educational inequities that were exacerbated by the pandemic, to bring to the table the voices of those who can best speak to how to meet these goals at both the state and district levels, and to promote accountability, transparency, and the effective use of funds. As we think about these resources, there are two things I would sort of highlight thematically, and then I'll talk really briefly about the buckets of funds. One is the focus on underserved students. It's clear in the statute and in the way that the department is advancing its resources to states and school districts to help them use these funds, that there is a clear priority on ensuring that those students most impacted by the pandemic are able to receive the kinds of robust supports, again, across social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs that will help to support them and make up for the impact of the lost instructional time. And then second is, as I mentioned, stakeholder engagement. Not only do we think that stakeholder engagement is important, but the department has actually required it. States are required to submit plans to the department in June, and they must undergo a robust and diverse and representative stakeholder input process before they do. And then school districts are also required to develop plans on their uses of funds and make them transparent, and they're required to undergo stakeholder engagement as they do also. We think that those are really critical opportunities to ensure that these resources really live up to their potential. And then thinking just about how that plays out in the buckets of funds, the American Rescue Plan's ESSER fund includes resources at both the state and the school district levels. At the state level, states are required to invest at least 5% of the total amount of funds that come into the state on evidence-based strategies that address the impact of lost instructional time, at least 1% on summer learning and enrichment, and at least 1% on comprehensive after-school programs. And all of those strategies have to be evidence-based. They have to address students' social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs, and they have to address the needs of the students most impacted by the pandemic. So that's at the state level. At least 90% of all the funds go directly to school districts through the state. And those funds are really critical areas of decisions because school districts have a lot of flexibility to figure out how to use those funds to meet their specific needs. One of the key requirements, though, is that school districts must use at least 20% of the funds that they receive on evidence-based strategies that address the academic impact of lost instructional time, what some people call learning loss and what we don't. And that those strategies at the school district level, again, need to address students' social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs, and be focused in particular on the students most impacted by the pandemic. And so together at the state and local level, with the lens of focusing on underserved students and with the lens of stakeholder engagement, we think that there's a critical opportunity here to accelerate the recovery from the pandemic, to support students, and to advance educational equity.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian. That's a fantastic overview, and I'd love to dig into some of the details. Again, folks, feel free to weigh in via the chat or to request to join by audio and video. There should be a button at the top right corner of your screen to do so. We'll let you on. I do see Denise from Education Trust has just hopped on. So Denise, anytime you're able to join by audio and video, would love to have your comments to weigh in on this and to have your expertise. I'd also be remiss if I didn't recognize Chris Amundsen, who is joining us, former head of the National Association of State Boards of Education, former delegate in the Virginia legislature, and a great partner in our work. I think as we kind of move on to the details of how to advance the goals that Ian was talking about, Phillip, it'd be great if you could weigh in on some of the particular things that we've been focused on at NewDEAL and working with you around college and career pathways, and how there might be some opportunity to further address those issues given all of these resources that are coming in.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And thanks again, Ian, for joining us. And it's a pleasure to be with the NewDEAL group once again. I think that as Ian spoke to, the law speaks really specifically to what some people call learning loss, others called unfinished learning. I think that we also get the issue here, and I think a major part of that is also the decline that we've seen in enrollment in post-secondary education as a result of the pandemic. And the data are pretty stark. This fall, there was a 7% decline in undergraduate enrollment. For students from low-income high schools, that was actually nearly an 11% decline. It continued this spring. The community college enrollment this spring was down by 11%. And we see that this is unfortunately continuing as we can look at FAFSA completion as a predictor of college enrollment the next in the fall, and FAFSA completion is down by nearly 10% as of this May. So all of this is to say that the impact of the pandemic, we can really see it from early childhood all the way through college enrollment, and the flexibility that's provided in the American Rescue Plan is something that we can use to address these short-term issues that we know are also the result of just structural problems in the system. And so we can really build back better by meeting short-term needs that simultaneously meet long-term needs. And that a lot of the recommendations that we put forth back in December are very applicable. And in fact, in the Department of Ed's COVID-19 handbook, a number of these things were referenced as possible uses of the funds. So, for example, dual enrollment, strategies that get students high school or college credit while they are still in college. Senator Parent spoke about the Georgia program as an example. You can use ARP money to expand these types of programs, but it's really important that that as we do this, that we take an equity lens, because dual enrollment tends to skew white and it tends to skew upper income. The same is true for advanced placement, international baccalaureate. I think for policymakers that are interested in taking this route, I'd really encourage the use of setting equity goals as a part of the process, as Senator Parent spoke. There are some structural things that you might want to consider as well. Rather than just having allowing students to take a dual enrollment course here or there, setting up sequences of dual enrollment courses so that students will graduate with substantial amounts of credit. In Indiana, for example, they have what they call the Indiana College Core, and it's a set of Gen Ed 30 Gen Ed credits, and students that take this, they graduate from high school, and they are well on their way, if they don't have to their associate's degree, or they have an associate's degree. And these type of structural things are ways that we can really bridge the disconnect between high school and higher ed. And of course, and then again, going back to something else that the Senator Parent said, particularly if you have a dual enrollment infrastructure, that doesn't necessarily mean that the students are engaged from a career perspective, and that college and career pathways are an evidence-based way to ensure that students stay in high school and go on to post-secondary. And so strategies where you are integrating high quality, rigorous academics, I think dual enrollment is a way to ensure that they're high quality, but also with CTE and work-based learning, you can put these pathways together with ARP funds, sort of building up this infrastructure. And the ARP funds, and Ian may want to speak more specifically to this, but the ARP funds, you can use them. They can be used until January 2025. They have to be obligated by September 2024, but then they have to be expended by January 2025. So there's a decent runway here to set up systems for bridging this gap between high school and higher education.
If I could just jump in on one point that Phillip made, I think the opportunities and the challenges around college and career readiness are really critical as we think about the use of these funds. And I think to Phillip's point, thinking about how we've seen FAFSA completion rates change during the pandemic is a great example of that. It's one of the very things that we at the department are trying to spotlight and amplify some best practices on. So Phillip mentioned the handbook. The department has put out 2 volumes of its COVID-19 handbook. which are intended to support states and school districts in addressing the health and safety and then the broader needs of their students. The second volume of the handbook really focuses on strategies like this and on evidence-based, equity-driven ways that schools and districts can be thinking about supporting their students through things like dual enrollment and other opportunities, and then across social, emotional, mental health, and academic needs. I also mentioned that we put out today some guidance on how states and school districts can use the funds under the recovery packages. And I just want to paste in the chat, if I'm technically able to do it, which I appear not to be. One of the questions is actually, how may an LEA use ESSER and GEAR funds to specifically support high school seniors? It's intended to help support some of those practices, and so we're actually very specific about strategies that a school district could consider. I guess I can't paste the whole thing in, but I'll maybe try to drive traffic to our website by pasting in the question and a link to where you can find it on the department site.
Yeah, please do that. We'd love to follow up on that. A question that we've dealt with this morning in our session, and I've talked about a lot with the group, is kind of balancing the uses of these funds as there's a one-time infusion of resources, and how people should think about that, and wondering just your thoughts on how you think about it as a one-time thing in terms of balancing maybe immediate programs that are needed to help kids get over the challenges of this particular moment, but also building a more equitable system, and what types of investments should be prioritized to do that when this is funding that's not going to go on forever.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right way to think about it. And I tend to think about the resources in like three broad buckets as we think about those issues around sustainability. The first is things that are largely one-time purchases, often related to health and safety in the context of the pandemic, that you would expect to see states and districts pay for. So if they need to upgrade their ventilation system to make it safer, that sort of thing. Those would tend to happen early. They would tend to be one time, and they obviously have a critical impact on enabling the safe return to in-person instruction. Second are a set of services and supports that are heightened over a relatively short period of time. So obviously, we're seeing significant mental health needs among students and educators as a result of the pandemic. You would expect to see expenditures to meet those mental health needs increase really significantly right now, and then taper off over time. And then third, you would expect to see a set of investments related to, again, those pre-existing educational inequities that states and school districts will work to address. And so those are investments that you would hope to see early, and then be maintained in different ways. And so not every investment is something that we would envision maintaining in a while, because they would fit into those three different categories. And so then when you think about the sustainability, I would emphasize that you layer onto it a few other things. So one is the president's commitment to increased resources for education, as we can see in the budget that's come out already. Second is the maintenance of effort requirements that come along with all of these pandemic funds, which ensure that states still continue to do their part to fund their education systems, so that those state funds don't go away, even as federal funds have increased over a multi-year period. And then third are what are called maintenance of equity provisions. These are new in the American Rescue Plan, and they ensure that the school districts and schools that serve the greatest share of students from low-income backgrounds do not experience disproportionate budget cuts as a result of changes in state and local budgets. And so all of those things are also really important as we think about those long-term sustainability issues.
That's terrific. I want to pivot in a moment to talk about another big issue that we've had. I'd love for Phillip and Senator Parent to weigh in on broadband access and the homework gap, and how much of an issue we've seen that is for students. But want to first go to a question in the chat, kind of following up on this focus on equity, but also wondering about how to center student voices and use their experiences of the last year to guide us as we plan and implement all of this. And Ian, you talked a bit about, stakeholder engagement. I don't know if you have a thought about how students fit into that engagement, and would love anybody else's thoughts as well.
Really briefly, students are an essential part of that engagement, so essential that we require it. We require states to engage students in as they seek input. We require school districts to seek student input as they do their engagement. When we say that the people most impacted need to be at the table, you can't do that unless you're also including students.
Great, and folks should continue to feel free to weigh in via the chat or to click. It should be in the top right corner of your screen to request to join via audio and video, and feel free to comment that way as well. As I mentioned a couple of times, one of the other main focuses of our education group has been this issue of broadband access. It's been so clear during the pandemic how much of a disadvantage students are at if they don't have access not only to internet, but just high quality, high speed broadband and devices and all of it. So certainly the digital divide is a top priority for us. And Phillip, I don't know if you want to, I know you've been doing a lot of work in this area, if you want to weigh in on how we might think about using rescue plan funds, either from the education buckets or of course, states and cities are getting additional funds that they have a lot of flexibility to use to address the broadband crisis that we really so many people are facing. And Senator, I know George is doing some work on this as well, but Phillip, would love to start with you.
Sure, I'd be happy to share some of what's in the Recovery Act to help to address broadband, the needs for broadband, and it's being rolled out as we speak in live time. So first, we did a study back in the summer to try to get a better handle of what the need is around broadband pre-pandemic, and we found that there were upwards of 17 million children in households that didn't have high-speed broadband. They may have a cell phone, but that's not exactly what's necessary to do real academic work. So and of course, as you might imagine, that the homework gap is disproportionately impacting those students who are already underserved. 1 in 3 Black, Latino, and American Indian families didn't have high-speed home internet. Fast forward to today, I think thanks to the efforts of school districts and working in partnership with companies, that some of the homework gap has been addressed, but not enough and not over the long term. These costs are recurring, and in many areas, the issue isn't just affordability; we can't afford it. The issue is that it's not there; it's an infrastructure problem. But to address these issues, the American Rescue Plan has a number of opportunities. So one, and actually even before the American Rescue Plan, the legislation that was passed in December, it doesn't get as much attention. But on the broadband issue, it really did quite a bit. They included over $3 billion for what's called the Emergency Broadband Benefit, and that went live just a few weeks ago, and already 1 million people have signed up. Through this emergency broadband benefit, your constituents can get a $50 discount on broadband access per month. On tribal lands, that increases to $75. And then there's also a benefit for devices. It's less generous. It's basically you can get a $100 benefit, $100 discount if the person pays between $10 and $50. So it's there, but really the issue, I think that the EBB really does a good job on the broadband front. It's focused on low-income individuals and households, families. If you're eligible for free and reduced price lunch, you're eligible for the EBB, for the Emergency Broadband Benefit. Importantly, students that receive Pell are eligible for EBB. And this is a real issue because the next program that I'm going to talk about, it really focuses on K-12 and not so much on higher ed. And so, but the emergency broadband benefit can support our students who are in post-secondary education as well. And I'll put in a link to information on the emergency broadband benefit in the chat. I'll put in 2 links, one that has information and one that you can use to direct people to sign up if I can figure out how to use the chat function, which I was able to do earlier, but now I'm not. There we go. That'll work. All right. Technology at its finest. So the next program, the FCC just issued the regulation for it like 2 weeks ago, and it's the Emergency Connectivity Fund that will be administered very similar to the E-rate program, and this will be mainly administered through districts and libraries. And it will provide high-speed home internet access for families and devices. Districts and libraries will be able to get hotspots to students. There's like a $250 cap per hotspot. They'll be able to pay for internet subscriptions. They'll be able to pay for devices up to $400 per device. If there's going to be an open window here soon for districts to get funding for future purchases, there's $7 billion has been appropriated to the program. So if there's money left over from that first window, then districts can get reimbursed for purchases that were made throughout the pandemic. But they're going to first cover what they call prospective purchases, so that we can address the homework gap that's sustained. The funding from ESSER that Ian was describing from the American Rescue Plan, that nearly $130 billion, technically those dollars can also be spent on broadband too. But because the FCC has these dollars, the emergency broadband benefit, the emergency connectivity fund, I really encourage folks to spend those dollars on broadband and use the ESSER funds for instructional needs, for meeting the social emotional needs of students. If there's still need after those funds are expended, then yes, there's allowable use of funds. But I think that it would be better to use the E-rate funds, the FCC funds, for connectivity purposes. There's some other funds that are also available. There's actually a $10 billion pot of money. Each state should be getting at least $100 million from the Treasury Department, actually, that can be used for broadband infrastructure. And then, as Ian alluded to, there's with the American Jobs Plan, there could be more.
Terrific. Senator, I don't know if you want to weigh in at all on the broadband piece specifically, or also just generally on, I mean, you're being on the ground and in a red state, of course, and what some of the challenges are that folks in Washington should know about that circumstance.
Right. Well, here in Georgia, we've actually had at least ostensible bipartisan agreement that we needed to build out broadband infrastructure for a number of years. But nothing actually happened as far as actually laying cable. We did a big mapping project. We had a lot of talking about it. I think people behind the scenes were trying to push some of the private companies. But the reality was and is that it was simply not going to be profitable for these companies to lay the line themselves and pick up the number of customers versus the cost. And so finally we were coming around, or I should say the Republicans were coming around to the idea that, like, yeah, we're going to actually have to put some money into building out broadband. And the point, as I said, it had been ostensibly bipartisan. Everyone agreed it needed to be done. It was always viewed as as a problem for economic development in rural Georgia. With the pandemic, it was also really driven home that it was a huge problem for kids, families, education. And really, I think more folks understood at a more basic level how having broadband these days is really, it's really a necessity, right? And to participate in modern life. So this year, the Governor Kemp put in like $10 million in the budget or something for building out broadband. And I think next year we're supposed to have $10 million for building out broadband. So that's like a total pittance. I can't remember how much they said it was going to cost us to do, but it's like somewhere between $2 and $5 billion to actually meet the needs of what we need here in Georgia. So one of the things that I'm really excited about and really hopeful about with the federal funds is making significant progress on the broadband project, because I do think it's critical. I think it's critical infrastructure, and I don't think we would have appropriately funded it at all at the state level. So I'm like, this should be a no-brainer. Let's get this done. But we'll see. You know, I got to be honest, like the way the money is spent is basically all within the control of the governor. And we put some things in the budget that said, like, here are some priority areas that we sort of want you to focus on: education, healthcare, broadband. But we're going to need to be really hawk-eyed about what he's doing. And right now he's busy. And, you know, I mean, it's obviously salient here in Georgia, but it's probably salient around the country too. So I'll go ahead and mention that our governor is sort of trapped. He's trying to shore up his base. He still has Trump not liking him. He's getting censured from some GOP local chapters still. So he's got to ward off like a good primary challenge. He has one, but it's a joke. So it's like, all right, he's got to, you know, he's like yelling about CRT. You know, I mean, we're stuck in all this politics. And so I hope that even though he has this like tightrope he has to walk, and I think this is, I wouldn't go on about it, except that I think it's salient for a lot of the Republicans around the country. This tightrope he needs to walk in between being like Trumpy enough and not alienating the Stop the Steal base to have enough of them come out and vote for him in a state that's rapidly more purple. So would he probably expand Medicaid? You know, we haven't expanded Medicaid. So would he do that if he could? Maybe. But I think the politics are still tricky. And I think he's a governor that has some serious pressures politically on the right, as well as a sort of tightrope act to follow in the middle. And so I hope that broadband will be a win. I hope that he will be a good leader and make some smart choices about the money that is available to 11 million Georgians. But I don't have a ton of confidence because the politics will override if push comes to shove.
Thank you, Senator, for bringing in the politics of it, which I think is something that's important. And I see we have a comment from Christine, one of our representatives.
Yeah,
in Florida.
Florida.
They've got
like even worse than us.
A similar, you say maybe worse situation. I think. Do we have Denise now? Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I apologize for all of the technical issues, and I think Senator mentioned off the top how much she was excited for us to be able to do this in person again sometime soon, and we are all very excited to be able to do that and not have to deal with that, not count on the technology to make this work. But thank you for persisting and making the time for us today. And I think we'd love to turn to you on one issue that I think is related to the question about the politics and bringing it back to kind of the education funding around the rescue plan is, I think, and maybe Ian can weigh in after you on this too. You know, I think there's some protections, there's supposed to be some protections in the rescue plan for ensuring states do the right thing and governors do the right thing, and these funds aren't used in ways that exacerbate inequality instead of doing what they're supposed to do. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of the requirements that are in there and ways that state and local officials, particularly maybe in red states, should be keeping an eye out for how these funds are spent and just understanding the protections that are supposed to be there to make sure that it's done equitably.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it's good to see so many friends. I can see you, and you all look great.
Thank you.
This is it's a incredible opportunity that we have before us, and thanks to the Department of Education for really leading the way and putting their muscle and might behind this opportunity. But at the same time, for anybody who's on the ground in classrooms and making some of these tough decisions, it's also an opportunity to screw up horribly. And I think that's where the Education Trust is sort of critically focused. How do we ensure that these funds will be impactful for those who need it the most at this time, particularly when we know that these same communities were already, pushed out and under-resourced across a variety of areas, not just in healthcare, but in housing and nutrition. And then you add education into this, they were already experiencing tremendous pressures. And so we have an opportunity here to do things right. And I think there's a number of things that I think we should call attention to that will help policymakers and school leaders, but only when done with the attention that it needs. The first thing I just want to call out is we did think it was critically important that the department reinforce the need for real planned stakeholder engagement, because unless the people who are going to be impacted by this the most have a voice in how these dollars can be used and the effective use of them, we're missing the boat immediately. So for planned stakeholder engagement, and this needs to happen both at the state level, but also at the local level. And second to that, we know already how to reach many of these communities that are in critical need at this time, because there are we have a tremendous asset in a significant number of community-based organizations that are already working with schools and with families to provide services. So they too should be connected to the conversation. We don't necessarily need to stand up something new everywhere you go, because you have folks like CASA, because you have folks like, Reading Partners, you have folks like the Urban League who have been dedicated to this kind of work for years and know how to reach the communities that we need to be reaching. The other thing that we found to be particularly important is there is an evidence-based requirement. And I know for some folks, evidence is sort of like facts. When you see them. But in this instance, there is a lot of evidence to be brought to bear on quality programs that work. If you're talking about extended day, there's a lot of evidence on what works. Intensive tutoring, there's a lot of evidence on what works. I think the clear need here, though, is to be able to get that information out, right, to the communities that need that. And so we're pushing on that, making sure that the evidence base is freely accessible and knowable and consumable. I think the last thing, and then I'll stop, we have a couple documents on our website that I'd love to be able to share. One of them is 5 questions to ask districts, to ensure that federal stimulus funding will be used well. And then we also have something similar for state actors and some of the things that state leaders need to be thinking about. So I think I can drop those in the chat and that'll work out. But if I can't, I'm sure the NewDEAL folks will make sure that they get it to everybody who's here today.
Yeah, for sure. We should definitely share that. Maybe we should come back actually to have you kind of summarize kind of the 5 points document as well. But before I do that, just wondering if you have anything to add on kind of this idea of protections that are in, you talked about this a little bit, but just protections that are in the rescue plan, you know, against what some of our folks would see as concerns about how governors who are not of the same party, particularly, and other leaders who have a lot of control over rescue plan funds might use them.
Yeah, well, I'll take myself out of the political part of that question. But first of all, I agree with everything that Denise said about the important provisions on how the resources are used and the process around making those use of fund decisions at both the state and local levels, as we've talked about, and doing so through an equity lens. The only points that I would add, I'd come back to what I mentioned before, particularly as so many states are currently going through the process of their appropriations and state budgets for the coming year, about the maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity provisions in the American Rescue Plan. And so those provisions are really critical protections. And maintenance of effort in particular serves to make sure that a state is continuing to do its job to fund its schools, even as these new federal resources are made available. And so there are a couple of maintenance of effort provisions. The most recent ones make sure that states are continuing to fund K-12 schools and continuing to fund higher education at the same share, at least, of the total state budget. And that's a really critical protection to make sure that the underlying base of resources that are essential to operate our schools over the long term don't disappear right now. And then second are what I mentioned as the maintenance of equity provisions. And those make sure that where a state or a school district might be reducing funds, that the schools and districts that serve the greatest shares of students from low-income backgrounds do not disproportionately bear the brunt of those potential budget cuts on a per pupil basis. And in some cases, that the school districts that serve the greatest shares of students from low-income backgrounds are even more protected. And those are really critical components to making sure that our overall education funding system does not become more inequitable and does not fail to live up to its commitment to students during this critical moment where more resources are obviously necessary in order to address the disproportionate impact of the pandemic and the underlying inequities in our education system.
Thank you for that. And I saw when you were talking, Senator Parrott mentioned we're not doing that in Georgia, and I'm not sure what that particularly was referring to, but Ian, wondering.
Yeah, we maintained 500 million in education cuts in the upcoming fiscal year's budget. And I asked a lot of questions about it, and it was, well, we're getting all this money from the feds. And, you know, we have a very bad track record over the last 20 years in fully funding our very outdated funding formula. It dates from the 80s. There have been successive attempts to modernize it. They've all failed. And so it's already woefully inadequate, and we've only fully funded it twice in 20 years. Because 20 years ago, the Republicans took over. I want to be clear about that.
Yeah. Ian, I don't know if you have a specific response to that, but also just like if there's a resource that we can share with, you know, obviously for the other folks who are in this meeting and other folks who are part of NewDEAL in terms of where, is there somewhere they can turn at the department if they are concerned?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. So there are two things. One, there's a transparency portal where you can actually see the maintenance of effort data that states have given us so far. It'll actually be updated in the pretty near future with the most recent data that we've received. And then we've also issued guidance to states on maintenance of effort data. And that guidance is really important. You know, obviously part of it is a technical document, but it's really a values document. And it spells out very clearly that as the department is considering a request by states to waive maintenance of effort, we are going to make those decisions based on what's best for students and through the lens of recognizing that the purpose of these federal resources is to increase support for students at the K-12 and higher education levels, not to supplant existing state funds. And so obviously this is something that we'll see play out over some period of time. It's you know, really important that we keep our eyes on the ball on this, which is we need net new resources to provide more supports to the students who are most impacted by the pandemic.
Great, thank you for that. And I'd encourage any leaders, if you have concerns about this, what's happening in your state, to reach out to us, and we'll try to help, connect you to the right people. I know we're getting close to time for wrapping up, but would love to bring it back to one of the points where we started on, and Denise, would love to engage you on this point, which is around unfinished learning and the direct, immediate impact of the pandemic on students. And I think you have some thoughts on what are immediate steps that should be taken. What are immediate strategies that folks should be seeing on the ground to best help the students who have been most impacted by the challenges of this year? Denise, do we still have you? I think you're on mute.
Yep, you got me. Sorry.
Perfect.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we thank you for asking about that, because we do think that there are 5 big questions that advocates should be asking districts related to how the stimulus funds should be used, and how to address unfinished learning. We don't call it learning loss at the Education Trust. We call it unfinished learning because we do believe that some kids may have some of the content mismatched, but they are still learning. They've also had different experiences. So we are really focused on talking to unfinished learning. There we think there are 3 very common sense strategies for how you would address unfinished learning. And we've done a couple different pieces on this issue with our friends at Future Ed, DFER, CAP, the late Bob Slavin with Success for All, talking about what we believe to be really critical at this moment. I like to call out the issue around strong relationships. Like when our children get back to school, one of the things that'll be most critical is to make sure that they have a person, a leader, several people where they can develop really strong relationships that will help them transition back into the new classroom, which is going to be so different from what so many experienced last year if they were sitting in their bedroom with their siblings, doing class, and the year before where they got cut off and told to go home in March, and then say, we don't know what's happening next. So all of those transitions, health transitions, unemployment, the racial reckoning, that has impacted our students. And so having some strong relationships, strong adult relationships, is going to be really important as they get back to school. 2 other things that, and I can drop this in the chat as well, that we really believe more folks should be paying attention to. There's been a lot of talk about tutoring and what that can look like. We do believe that intensive tutoring is a strategy, and those funds that were that Ian is helping get out there from the American Rescue Plan can be used, actually are required to be used, some portion of it, for these types of strategy after school, summer learning, expanded day. Intensive tutoring is something that we also believe folks should be focused on. And intensive tutoring, there are a variety of models out there, but we believe that there are some that have more research base than others. Teachers are great, as are paraprofessionals, but you could also bring in a college student as long as they've had some training, some professional development, consistent professional development. These groups need to be really small. We're not talking about 20 to 1. We're talking about 3 to 4 to 1. Yes, that's going to take an investment, but folks, the money is there. Let's pay attention to it. And, there's also going to need an infrastructure. And that's something also that we've been really focused on, is making sure that there's an infrastructure to support all this, not just for next year, but for the last 2 years. I know we're short on time, so I don't want to go too much over. But the last critical thing in terms of strong relationships, intensive tutoring, is there are ways to do expanded day that will add more time on task, that will help accelerate learning for those children who have unfinished learning. And again, models are out there that are working. Let me point to just one place if you guys are looking for resources on this. Proventutoring.org, which was built by our late friend Bob Slavin at Success for All, has some organizations out there that are ready to scale, and y'all should take advantage of it. So thanks for the question, Jonathan. And I will drop our research in the chat.
Terrific, and certainly look forward to continuing to partner with you all at Education Trust in navigating this time of great challenge, but also great opportunity, as we've been talking about. Just want to say thank you again to you, Denise, to Ian at the department. Really so grateful for your participation today. As always, to the Alliance for Excellent Education, which is just a fantastic partner of ours. Would leave it open if anybody has a last closing comment before we wrap up.
Just we are here to help if there are policies that you're looking to advance and would like an extra hand in putting them together. We're happy to do that. And in fact, in the coming days, we're going to be circulating a fact sheet that our friend Chris Amundsen drafted with ideas for using the ARP funds. We'd like to get some feedback from some of the NewDEAL leaders. We'll refine it and then send it out, and hopefully that can be just a helpful tool as you figure out the most effective use of this historic investment that's been made.
Yeah, really looking forward to getting that out to our co-chairs and to other NewDEAL leaders, and looking forward to being in touch with everyone about more opportunities to engage with the Education Policy Group in our work. As always, thanks to our co-chair, Senator Parent, to Mayor Reed, sorry he wasn't able to make it today, and Mayor Cabalden for all their leadership. Please stay engaged with us, and we'll be in touch with more opportunities. Programming will continue at 3 o'clock on the stage with our closing plenary session, so hope you will join us for that. We've got panels on police reform, great discussion on state of our democracy, and some closing remarks from Cedric Richmond at the White House. So really looking forward to that. Again, 3 o'clock on the stage. You just click on the left of your screen. Thank you all for being here, and hope to see you all again soon.